The wagon wheels had stopped turning 3 days ago, and Margaret knew she was running out of time. She crouched behind a cluster of prairie grass, watching the settlement fade into the distance as the morning sun painted the horizon in shades of blood orange. Her wedding dress, once pristine white silk shipped all the way from Boston, now hung in tatters around her ankles, stained with mud and torn by thorns. She had been promised to Harold Grimshaw, a cattle baron twice her age with a reputation for cruelty that even the preacher couldn't ignore during the ceremony rehearsal. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she remembered the look in Harold's eyes when they first met at the train station. It wasn't love or even basic kindness she saw there. It was ownership, the same look he gave his prize horses before breaking them to saddle. Her father had signed the contract before she even left Philadelphia, trading his gambling debts for her future. The arrangement was simple and brutal, marriage in exchange for financial salvation. Nobody asked what Margaret wanted, and by the time she understood the full horror of her situation, the iron cage had already closed around her. The night before the wedding, she had overheard Harold talking to his foreman through the thin walls of the boarding house. His words chilled her blood more than the Dakota winter wind. He spoke of discipline and obedience, of making sure his new wife understood her place from the very first night. He laughed about the last woman who had tried to defy him, a housekeeper who left his employment with a broken arm and a silence that spoke volumes. Margaret made her decision in that moment, with moonlight streaming through the curtains and her future crystallizing into a nightmare she refused to accept. She fled at midnight, stealing a horse and whatever supplies she could carry. The animal threw her within the first mile, spooked by a rattlesnake that emerged from the darkness like a rope of living death. Margaret ran on foot after that, her fashionable boots disintegrating with each desperate step. She followed the stars her brother had taught her to read during their childhood summers, heading west toward the territories where Harold's reach might not extend. Every sound made her flinch. Every shadow could be a search party sent to drag her back to a fate worse than death itself. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, an ocean of grass that offered no shelter and no mercy. Margaret's lips cracked and bled from dehydration. Her skin burned under the relentless sun, turning from porcelain white to angry red within hours. She had never known such thirst, such complete and total exhaustion. The romantic novels she had read in Philadelphia never mentioned the reality of frontier survival, the way hunger twisted your stomach into knots or how loneliness could become a physical weight pressing down on your shoulders until you wanted to scream into the void. On the third day, her legs finally gave out. Margaret collapsed near a dried creek bed, certain she would die there alone and unmissed. Her last coherent thought was of her mother, dead these past 5 years, and whether heaven looked anything like this endless expanse of golden grass and merciless sky. She closed her eyes, welcoming the darkness that promised an end to suffering, unaware that her greatest trial was about to begin. When she woke, the sun had moved significantly across the sky. A shadow fell across her face, cool and blessed. Margaret forced her eyes open, expecting to see vultures circling overhead or perhaps Harold's men come to claim their prize. Instead, she found herself staring up at a man unlike any she had ever seen. He sat astride a painted horse, watching her with eyes that held the depth of ancient storms. His skin was bronze, his hair long and black, adorned with feathers that caught the wind. She recognized him instantly from the descriptions she had heard whispered in frightened tones back at the settlement. She was looking at a Lakota chief, and her fate now rested entirely in his hands. Chief Dakota had been tracking the white woman for 2 days before he found her dying in the creek bed. His scouts had reported the unusual sight of a woman alone on the prairie, dressed in what appeared to be ceremonial clothing from the white settlements. The description intrigued him enough to investigate personally, though his warriors counseled caution. Relations between the Lakota and the settlers had grown increasingly tense, with broken treaties and violent clashes becoming commonplace. Bringing a white woman into their camp could be seen as an act of war or, worse, an invitation for the bluecoats to descend upon them with rifles and cannons. But Dakota had not become chief by following conventional wisdom alone. He had earned his position through a combination of strategic brilliance and an uncanny ability to read situations others missed. As he studied the unconscious woman below him, he saw beyond the superficial details of her pale skin and foreign clothing. He saw the torn fabric that spoke of desperate flight, the blooded feet that told of impossible distances traveled without proper preparation, and the bruises forming on her wrists that suggested recent restraint. This was not a settler's wife on a leisurely journey gone wrong. This was a woman running from something terrible. Dakota dismounted and knelt beside Margaret, checking for signs of life. Her pulse fluttered weakly beneath his fingers, like a trapped bird beating against a cage. He lifted her with surprising gentleness for a man of his size and strength, settling her across his horse before climbing up behind her, The decision to bring her to his village would be questioned, perhaps even challenged, but Lakota had learned long ago that leadership meant making difficult choices when others preferred the easy path. Besides, there was something about this woman that reminded him of his own sister, lost to a band of white traders who had promised fair exchange but delivered only violence and theft. The ride back to the village took most of the afternoon. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling words in English that Lakota had learned during his time as a young warrior negotiating with traders. She spoke of someone named Harold, her voice filled with terror each time she uttered the name. She begged for mercy, cried out for help that never came, and whispered apologies to someone she called mother. Lakota's jaw tightened as he listened. He had seen enough of what white men did to their women to fill a lifetime with rage. They kept them like property, beat them like animals, and then called it civilization. When they reached the village, the entire camp fell silent. Children stopped their games mid-throw. Women paused over cooking fires, their eyes widening in disbelief. Warriors reached for weapons instinctively, unsure whether this was threat or trophy. Lakota's second-in-command, a scarred veteran named Chaitin, approached with undisguised concern etched across his weathered face. The conversation that followed was conducted in rapid Lakota, too fast for any settler to follow, but the tension was universal in any language. Chaitin argued that keeping the woman was madness, that her people would come searching with soldiers and rifles, that the tribe could not afford another conflict with the whites when they were still recovering from the last brutal winter. Other voices joined his, some calling for the woman to be returned immediately to prevent retaliation, others suggesting she be left at the edge of settler territory to find her own way. A few of the younger warriors made darker suggestions that Lakota silenced with a single sharp gesture. He carried Margaret to his own lodge, ignoring the protests and whispered conversations that erupted in his wake. Inside the cool interior of buffalo hide and wooden poles, he laid her on a bed of furs and called for Winona, the tribe's healer. The old woman arrived with her medicine bag, clicking her tongue in disapproval but setting to work without argument. She had known Lakota since he was a boy and understood that his stubbornness, once set, was as immovable as the Black Hills themselves. Winona cleaned Margaret's wounds with practiced efficiency, applying herbal poultices that would draw out infection and promote healing. She forced water between the unconscious woman's cracked lips, then a bitter tea that would restore strength and fight fever. As she worked, Lakota sat nearby, watching the healer's movements while his mind raced through possibilities and consequences. He knew that this decision would define his leadership, perhaps even determine the future of his people. But looking at Margaret's battered form, he also knew that turning away from someone in need was a betrayal of everything his grandfather had taught him about honor and courage. Outside, the council fire was already being prepared. The elders would demand answers, and Lakota would have to justify his actions to people who had every right to question his judgment. The woman represented danger on multiple levels, political, social, and strategic. Yet something in Lakota's spirit told him that saving her life was important in ways he couldn't yet understand. Sometimes the right path was also the most difficult one, and a true leader walked it regardless of the cost. As night fell over the village, Margaret stirred for the first time in hours. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim light filtering through the lodge opening. The face that swam into focus above her was weathered and strong, belonging to an old woman who smiled with surprising kindness. Winona spoke in a language Margaret didn't understand, but the tone was soothing, almost maternal. For the first time since fleeing the settlement, Margaret felt something unexpected blooming in her chest, a fragile, tentative seed of hope. Margaret woke to voices raised in argument, though the words themselves remained foreign and incomprehensible. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted the movement as pain shot through her battered body. Every muscle screamed in protest, and her head pounded with a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. The lodge around her was unlike anything she had seen before, animal hides stretched over a conical frame, decorated with painted symbols that told stories she couldn't read. The air smelled of sage and smoke, unfamiliar but not unpleasant. Winona appeared at her side instantly, pressing her back down onto the furs with gentle but firm hands. The old woman offered water in a carved wooden cup, and Margaret drank greedily, not caring that some spilled down her chin and onto her ruined dress. Food came next, a thick stew that tasted of meat and roots, strange but nourishing. Margaret ate without question, driven by a hunger so intense it overrode any concern about what exactly she was consuming. Survival had stripped away the refinements of civilized behavior, leaving only the basic animal need to sustain life. Outside the lodge, the tribal council had gathered around a large fire. Lakota stood before them, his posture straight and defiant despite the challenges being thrown at him from all sides. The debate had been raging since sunset, with no clear resolution in sight. Some elders demanded that Margaret be returned to the white settlement immediately, arguing that keeping her would invite retaliation that could destroy them all. Others suggested using her as a bargaining chip in negotiations with the settlers, perhaps trading her safe return for concessions on hunting territories or access to winter grazing lands. Chaitin, usually Dakota's most loyal supporter, stood to voice his concerns. His words carried weight borne from decades of warfare and survival. He spoke of the pattern that always followed when whites and Lakota clashed: escalation, retribution, and eventually the arrival of soldiers who made no distinction between guilty and innocent. He described the burned villages he had seen, the women and children left homeless by conflicts that started with far less provocation than harboring a runaway white woman. His voice cracked with emotion as he recounted these memories, and several council members nodded in grim agreement. But Dakota had anticipated these arguments and prepared his response carefully. He reminded the council of their own history, of the times when Lakota warriors had been sheltered by other tribes when fleeing from enemies. He spoke of the code that governed their people, the sacred duty to protect those who sought sanctuary, regardless of their origin. He pointed out that the woman had been running from something terrible, that her condition when he found her spoke of abuse and desperation. Would they truly turn their backs on someone in need simply because her skin was a different color? The debate shifted when Dakota revealed what he had learned from Margaret's fevered mumblings. He described the man named Harold and the context he had pieced together: a forced marriage, threats of violence, a future of servitude disguised as respectability. Several of the women in the council exchanged meaningful glances. Though the specifics of their cultures differed, they understood what it meant to be treated as property, to have your body and future decided by men who saw you as a commodity rather than a person. An elder named Hanskar rose slowly, his age making every movement deliberate. He had lived through more than 70 winters and carried the wisdom of countless seasons in his weathered face. When he spoke, everyone fell silent out of respect for his experience and judgment. Hanskar told a story from his youth, about a time when a Crow woman had fled to their camp seeking protection from a cruel husband. The tribe had sheltered her, and though it caused temporary tension with the Crow, it had ultimately led to a peace agreement that lasted a generation. Sometimes, Hanskar said, the brave choice yielded unexpected rewards. The council deliberated until the moon reached its zenith. Finally, they reached a compromise that satisfied no one completely but offered a path forward. Margaret would be allowed to stay until she recovered from her ordeal, but she would then face a choice: return to her people or prove her value to the tribe by learning their ways and contributing to the community. If she chose to stay, she would live under Dakota's protection but would have to earn the trust and acceptance of the village through her actions. If anyone came searching for her, the tribe would make their decision based on what they had learned of her character and the circumstances of her arrival. Dakota accepted the terms, knowing it was the best outcome he could hope for given the circumstances. When he returned to his lodge to share the news with Margaret, he found her sitting up, wrapped in a buffalo robe that Winona had provided. Her eyes were clearer now, the fog of dehydration and exhaustion beginning to lift. She looked at him with a mixture of fear and gratitude, understanding on some instinctive level that this man had saved her life and was now responsible for determining her future. Through gestures and the few English words he knew, Dakota conveyed the council's decision. Margaret listened carefully, her face showing the rapid calculations happening behind her eyes. She thought of Harold Grimshaw waiting at the settlement, probably organizing a search party at this very moment. She thought of her father, who had sold her like livestock to cover his debts. She thought of the life that awaited her if she returned, a cage made of promises and threats, with no hope of escape or happiness. When Dakota finished explaining, Margaret surprised him by speaking clearly despite her parched throat. Her voice was soft but determined, carrying a strength that her broken body couldn't quite hide. She said one word that needed no translation, a word that would change the course of both their lives: stay. Then she repeated it in case he hadn't understood, her eyes meeting his directly for the first time. I want to stay. Dakota nodded slowly, acknowledging the weight of her decision. He didn't smile or offer false promises about what lay ahead. The path she had chosen would be difficult, perhaps more challenging than anything she had faced in her previous life. But he saw something in her gaze that convinced him she was capable of more than anyone might expect from a Philadelphia society girl who had never known hardship until these past few days. She had survived the unsurvivable, and that kind of resilience couldn't be taught, it had to be discovered through trial and suffering. Outside, the village settled into uneasy sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and questions that currently had no answers. But for tonight, Margaret was safe, and that was enough. The first weeks were harder than anything Margaret had imagined possible. She woke each morning to a world that operated by rules she didn't understand, speaking a language that sounded like music but conveyed meaning she couldn't grasp. Winona became her constant companion and reluctant teacher, guiding her through the basic tasks of daily survival with a patience that bordered on miraculous. Learning to process buffalo hide left Margaret's hands bleeding and raw. Carrying water from the stream in heavy leather pouches strained muscles she never knew existed. Even the simple act of maintaining the fire in Dakota's lodge required techniques that took days to master. The women of the tribe watched her struggles with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Some whispered among themselves whenever Margaret passed, their voices carrying tones she recognized even without understanding the words: judgment, suspicion, resentment. She was an outsider, a reminder of the people who had broken treaties and stolen land. Her presence disrupted the natural order of village life, and many made no secret of their desire to see her fail and leave. Only Winona's protection and Dakota's authority kept the worst of the hostility at bay. Margaret threw herself into learning with an intensity that surprised even Winona. She memorized Lakota words with fierce determination, practicing pronunciation until her tongue ached from the unfamiliar sounds. She observed everything: how the women moved, how they worked together, the subtle hierarchies that governed social interactions. Her hands, once soft and useless for anything beyond needlework and piano playing, developed calluses that mapped her transformation from delicate ornament to functional member of the community. Dakota maintained a careful distance, aware that any perceived favoritism toward Margaret would undermine his authority and fuel resentment. He watched her progress from afar, noting how she never complained despite obvious pain and exhaustion. When she fell, she got up. When she failed at a task, she tried again. There was steel beneath her refined exterior, a core of determination that reminded him of warriors he had known who refused to break regardless of what the world threw at them. He found himself respecting this woman in ways he hadn't anticipated. The turning point came during a violent storm that struck the village without warning. Wind howled across the prairie with enough force to threaten the lodges themselves, and rain fell in sheets that turned the ground to treacherous mud. Margaret was helping Winona secure medicine supplies when she heard screaming from the far side of the camp. A young child had wandered too close to the swollen creek and been swept away by the sudden surge of water. Without thinking, Margaret ran toward the sound, her body moving on instinct honed by weeks of physical labor. She saw the child struggling in the current, tiny hands grasping uselessly at water rushing past with deadly force. Margaret didn't hesitate. She plunged into the creek, the cold hitting her like a physical blow and stealing the breath from her lungs. The current fought her with every stroke, trying to drag her under and add her to its collection of victims. But Margaret had not survived Harold Grimshaw and 3 days dying on the prairie just to be defeated by water. She pushed forward with grim determination, closing the distance to the child inch by agonizing inch. Her hand closed around the small wrist just as they both went under. Margaret kicked hard, propelling them toward the surface with legs burning from exertion. They broke free of the water gasping, and she managed to angle their trajectory toward the bank where several warriors had gathered. Strong hands pulled them both to safety, and Margaret collapsed on the muddy ground, coughing up creek water while the child cried in someone's arms nearby. She had saved a life, and in doing so, she had proven something essential to the watching tribe. The child's mother, a woman named Marka who had been among Margaret's harshest critics, fell to her knees beside her. Tears streamed down Marka's face as she spoke words Margaret was beginning to understand: gratitude, apology, acceptance. Other women gathered around, their expressions transformed from suspicion to something approaching respect. Margaret had put herself at risk for one of their own without hesitation, and that kind of courage transcended cultural boundaries. Actions spoke a universal language, and Margaret's had proclaimed her worth louder than any words could manage. Dakota arrived to find Margaret being helped back to his lodge by a group of women who had previously shunned her. Winona was chattering excitedly in Lakota, recounting the rescue to anyone who would listen. The chief felt something shift in his chest as he watched Margaret walk past, her hair plastered to her head and her clothes soaked through, yet somehow more beautiful than the pristine bride who had fled into the prairie weeks ago. She had shed the trappings of her former life and emerged as someone new, someone forged by necessity into a stronger version of herself. That evening, Marka brought food to Dakota's lodge, a gift and a gesture of reconciliation. Other families followed throughout the night, each offering small tokens of appreciation and acceptance. Margaret sat in stunned silence as her space filled with offerings, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of fortune. Winona explained that she had been tested and found worthy, that the tribe recognized her as one of their own now. The formal adoption ceremony would come later, but in the eyes of the people, she had already earned her place. As the visitors finally departed and quiet settled over the lodge, Margaret allowed herself to cry for the first time since arriving at the village. The tears came not from sadness but from relief so profound it physically hurt. She had found something she never had in Philadelphia or at the settlement, a place where her worth was measured by her actions rather than her appearance or family connections. She had discovered strength she didn't know she possessed and proven to herself that she was capable of surviving anything the world threw at her. Lakota entered the lodge to find her crying softly in the firelight. He sat down across from her, maintaining the respectful distance he had established, but his eyes held a warmth that hadn't been there before. He spoke in careful English, the words coming slowly but with clear intent. He told her she had done well, that she had honored his decision to bring her to the village. Then he added something that made Margaret's breath catch: she was no longer simply a runaway bride under his protection. She was Waste Win, beautiful woman who found courage, and she had earned the right to call this place home. 3 months passed in a blur of learning and growth that transformed Margaret from frightened refugee into confident member of the tribe. She had mastered enough Lakota to hold basic conversations, and her hands could now process hides, prepare food, and perform dozens of other tasks without conscious thought. The women who once viewed her with suspicion now sought her company, appreciating her willing spirit and quick mind. Children followed her around the village, delighted by the strange songs she taught them from her Philadelphia childhood. Margaret had found something she never expected: belonging, purpose, and the first real happiness she had ever known. But peace on the prairie was always temporary, and the past had a way of catching up no matter how far you ran. The warning came from scouts who had been monitoring the trading posts for signs of trouble. A group of heavily armed white men had arrived asking questions about a missing bride, offering a substantial reward for information about her whereabouts. The description matched Margaret perfectly, down to the torn wedding dress and the distinctive locket she wore around her neck, a family heirloom she hadn't been able to abandon even in her desperate flight. Harold Grimshaw had not given up his prize, and now he was coming to claim it with enough firepower to level the village if necessary. The scouts reported at least 20 men, including several who had the look of professional gunfighters rather than simple ranch hands. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a military operation designed to retrieve property and punish anyone who stood in the way. The tension that had eased over the past months returned instantly, sharp and dangerous as obsidian arrowheads. The council convened immediately, and this time the debate was even more heated than before. Many argued that Margaret must be returned to prevent bloodshed, that no single person was worth risking the entire tribe. Chayton pleaded with Lakota to see reason, reminding him of the women and children who would suffer if this escalated into violence. The pragmatic voices called for negotiation, suggesting they could perhaps broker a deal that would satisfy Grimshaw without surrendering Margaret completely. But everyone knew that men like Harold didn't negotiate; they took what they wanted and destroyed anything that got in their way. Margaret sat outside the council lodge, listening to her fate being decided by people arguing in a language she now understood well enough to follow the general thrust of the conversation. Fear coiled in her stomach like a living thing, but it was different from the terror she had felt fleeing the settlement. This fear came with anger, with a burning refusal to accept that her life could be derailed by a man who viewed her as property. She had worked too hard, come too far, and discovered too much about herself to simply surrender now. When Lakota emerged from the council meeting, his face was grim but determined. The elders had agreed to meet with Grimshaw's party under a flag of truce, hoping to resolve the situation without violence. But everyone knew this was a slim hope at best. Margaret stood to face him, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, chief and adopted daughter, protector and protected, two people whose lives had become intertwined in ways neither had planned or expected. Then Margaret spoke in clear Lakota, her words carrying to everyone within earshot. She would not run again. She would face Harold Grimshaw and make her choice known in front of both her old world and her new one. The meeting was set for the following morning at a neutral location halfway between the village and the settlement. Lakota insisted that Margaret remain behind, but she refused with a stubbornness that reminded him why he had brought her to the village in the first place. She had earned the right to speak for herself, and she would not be treated as a child or a possession any longer. Reluctantly, he agreed, though he tripled the warrior escort that would accompany them. Whatever happened at this meeting would determine not just Margaret's future but potentially the fate of his entire people. Harold Grimshaw looked exactly as Margaret remembered, tall, imposing, with cold eyes that assessed everything around him with the calculating gaze of a predator. He sat astride a magnificent black horse, flanked by men whose hands rested casually on rifle stocks in a display of barely restrained violence. When he saw Margaret, his face twisted into something that might have been relief or anger, perhaps both. He dismounted and strode toward her, ignoring the Lakota warriors who moved to intercept him, their presence a clear warning not to approach too quickly. The conversation that followed was conducted in English, with Dakota understanding enough to follow the key points. Harold demanded Margaret's immediate return, speaking of her as though she were a runaway horse that needed to be retrieved and properly broken. He offered compensation to the tribe for their trouble, though the amount was insultingly small and the tone suggested he considered even that much to be excessive generosity. When Dakota refused to simply hand Margaret over, Harold's facade of civility cracked, revealing the brutality that Margaret had fled months ago. Margaret stepped forward before the situation could deteriorate further. Her voice was steady as she addressed Harold directly, speaking truth she had never been brave enough to voice before. She rejected his claim to her life, refused the future he had planned without her consent, and declared that she would rather die on the prairie than return to his custody. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam. All the fear, anger, and determination that had built up over months of survival and transformation. She was not the same woman who had fled the settlement in a torn wedding dress. That person had died somewhere on the empty prairie, and who stood here now was someone entirely new. Harold's response was predictable. He lunged for Margaret, reaching to grab her arm and drag her away by force. But he had underestimated two critical factors: Margaret's newfound ability to defend herself and the Lakota warrior's protective instincts. Margaret sidestepped his grasp with surprising agility, while three warriors materialized between them with drawn weapons. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours, 20 armed white men facing 30 Lakota warriors, with Margaret caught in the middle and her future hanging in the balance. Dakota's voice cut through the tension like a knife through smoke. He spoke in English for Harold's benefit, his words chosen carefully to avoid provocation while making his position absolutely clear. Margaret was under the tribe's protection and had been formally adopted according to their laws and customs. She had chosen to stay of her own free will, and that choice would be respected. If Harold attempted to take her by force, it would be considered an act of war against the Lakota people. The consequences of such an action would extend far beyond this single confrontation, potentially igniting conflicts that would consume the entire region. Harold's face turned purple with rage. He sputtered threats and promises, invoking the authority of territorial government and the power of the United States Army. But even as he spoke, something shifted in his eyes. He was a businessman at heart, and businessmen understood costs versus benefits. Starting a war with the Lakota over one woman, no matter how much pride was involved, made no economic sense. His reputation might suffer from the loss, but his life and fortune would survive. If he pushed this confrontation to its logical conclusion, there were no guarantees about what would survive or who would pay the ultimate price. The retreat, when it came, was grudging and accompanied by dire warnings about future consequences. Harold remounted his horse, signaling his men to do the same. But before he left, he turned to Margaret one final time. His words were poison dressed as prophecy. She would regret this choice, she would die alone in the wilderness among savages, she had thrown away civilization for a fantasy that could never last. Margaret met his gaze without flinching, and in that moment, Harold saw that he had truly lost her. Whatever power he might have held over her had evaporated completely. As the dust from Harold's departure settled, Margaret felt something release in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying since the moment she first met the man months ago. Dakota placed a hand on her shoulder, the first time he had touched her since bringing her to the village. The gesture was brief but meaningful, conveying pride and respect that needed no translation. Margaret had faced her demon and won not through violence but through the strength of her conviction and the support of people who valued her for who she had become rather than who she had been. The journey back to the village was quiet, everyone processing what had just occurred. Margaret knew that challenges remained, Harold's threats weren't empty, and the tension between settlers and native peoples would only continue to grow. But she had made her choice and claimed her future on her own terms. She rode beside Dakota, no longer as a rescued runaway but as Waste Win, a woman who had found her courage in her home among people who measured worth by character rather than pedigree. That evening, the village celebrated with drums and dancing that lasted until the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns. Margaret danced with the others, her movements still clumsy but her spirit soaring with freedom she had never known existed. She had escaped one cage only to discover that the world beyond held possibilities she could never have imagined. The runaway bride had died on the prairie, and in her place stood someone new, someone stronger, braver, and finally, completely free.